Wow, Harry's able to give off a perfect impression of the Bloody Baron's voice? I knew Harry was a great leader, but a master impressionist on top of that? Why doesn't he use that skill more often? I can think of at least a few times when doing an impression of someone else's voice would have come in mighty handy. Spoiler warning. This is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. As Harry is performing his exams, his scar starts hurting him on a regular basis. He does his best to ignore the pains while he's taking his exams, a rather impressive feat seeing as we'll eventually learn that this is no ordinary scar. Harry is also constantly being woken up by his old nightmare. It's unclear which nightmare the narrator is referring to, the one with Quirrell and his turban that he had at the end of chapter 7, or the one where his parents vanish into a flash of green light, which he was having at the beginning of chapter 13. Either one would be narratively appropriate in this context. While taking their History of Magic exams, Hermione briefly mentions the 1637 Werewolf Code of Conduct. This is yet another aspect of world building that will never get brought up again, and I really wish it was explored more. As I mentioned in chapter 13 and later books, werewolves and their place in wizarding society will become a huge part of the story. So it would be really interesting to know the history of this code of conduct. What exactly did the code require werewolves to do? Why did it fail? Why isn't it still in effect to this day? Was it done in order to encourage wizards to be more willing to put up with werewolves, like what Remus Lupin would have wanted? Or was it a code of violence designed to retaliate against wizards for their mistreatment, like what Fenrir Greyback would have advocated for? Sadly, this will never get explored, and that just sucks. After the exams, the Golden Trio head off to the lake for some R&R. Fun fact, this is literally the only time in the entire series when we, the audience, get to see the giant squid. It is mentioned multiple times throughout the series, but this is the one and only time it actually makes an appearance. Imagine that! Anyway, as Harry is trying to relax despite his scar pain, he comes to a sudden realization. This is the first instance of Harry's detective skills at work. I've mentioned several times up to this point that Harry is a natural-born leader, and I've made a point to point out the numerous times in this book that his leadership skills are built up. But in addition to being a natural-born leader, he is also a prodigy detective. His ability to actually connect the dots on various mysteries is absolutely glorious, and the best part is that it isn't even all that contrived. In chapter 13, I complained about how Harry's memory is contrived as hell, but his ability to do detective work is not. Every time Harry connects the dots on a mystery in this series, it always feels natural and organic. And this is the first instance where Harry's detective skills are built up. Harry's epiphany doesn't come out of nowhere, it actually comes to him organically. He sees a post owl and he thinks of Hagrid, the only one at this point in time who sends Harry letters. Thinking of Hagrid, it makes him realize how Hagrid wouldn't have given away the secret to getting past Fluffy. But then he realizes there might have been at least one point when it might have actually slipped by accident. This chain of thought is surprisingly organic and well plotted, and based on realistic stimulus, so I have to give mad props for Rowling being able to pull that out of a hat. So Harry goes to ask Hagrid about the card game where he got the dragon egg. Hagrid admits that he was drunk off his ass when he played the game of cards, which almost certainly lowered his guard. He mentioned that the secret to calming Fluffy down is to play him some music. Just do that and he falls to sleep almost immediately. This sends chills down the Golden Trio's spines as they realize that Hagrid obviously told this to the guy who gave him the dragon egg, and that guy was most likely Voldemort, or at the very least, Quirrell working for Voldemort. Now, back in Chapter 9, I complained about the reason why Fluffy hadn't killed Harry, Ron, and Hermione and Neville. I felt that the reason given, that he was taken by surprise by their sudden appearance, was stretching incredulity. I opined that saying that he was asleep was a far more sensible explanation for why it took so long for Fluffy to spring into action. I acknowledged that his being asleep is supposed to be his weakness, but I also said that I would have some things to say about that weakness when the time arose. Well, the time has arisen, so here is why I believe this weakness of Fluffy's is bullshit. First, it's important to understand just what exactly Hagrid means when he says that Fluffy falls to sleep. Later in this chapter, when the Golden Trio enter the corridor, when Harry plays the wooden flute that Hagrid gave him for Christmas, Fluffy falls to sleep immediately. I like to listen to music whenever I sleep, but I don't fall asleep the instant I start hearing music. Also, if Harry stops playing the music, even for a split second, Fluffy immediately wakes up. It's also clear that Fluffy doesn't appear to have the ability to simply ignore the music. When I'm putting on some music to go to sleep, I have the option, if I am so inclined, to tune that music out and refuse to go to sleep in case I need to do something, such as go to the bathroom or answer the door. Fluffy clearly can't do that. If any music happens within earshot of Fluffy, he instantly and involuntarily goes to sleep. So this isn't so much actual organic sleep as much as it is a magically induced sleep-like event that is triggered upon hearing music. That's an important distinction to make because it subsequently sets up a whole slew of questions about how the mechanics of this spell actually work. First of all, could just any music put Fluffy to sleep like that? I certainly don't listen to death metal when I'm trying to sleep, because that would be counterproductive to helping me relax. Would death metal music be enough to put old Fluffy to sleep? For that matter, does the musician even have to be very good at the music he's playing? Harry initially puts Fluffy to sleep by playing the flute, but does Harry even know how to play a flute? They don't teach you how to play musical instruments at Hogwarts, and I'm pretty sure the Dursleys wouldn't have signed Harry up for musical instrument lessons. In the USA, most music classes are only an elective. Are Muggles in the UK and the real world required to learn how to play flutes as part of their core curriculum? Is that how he knows how to play it? Or is he just blowing into the flute and making some sound come out while sounding like complete ass? If someone were to take a piano and just smash their hands on the keys like so, would that be just as effective at getting Fluffy to pass out as if they were actually skilled at it? For that matter, does it even have to be a musical instrument? For example, in Disney's Tarzan, when the animals are ransacking Jane's encampment, they start to create an impromptu musical number using objects that are definitively not musical instruments. Would that also work to put Fluffy to sleep? For that matter, does there even need to be any instrumental sound at all? Whether it comes from conventional musical instruments or just around the house stuff. Could a person just start singing a cappella and that would be enough? Again, do you even have to be very good at it? If your singing voice sounds like nails on a chalkboard, does it even matter? If you are so terrible at singing a cappella that a human would not even realize that you're trying to sing, does that even matter as far as Fluffy is concerned? If it doesn't matter, then does that mean Fluffy could even be put to sleep by accident? For example, if somebody comes along and is reciting Dr. Seuss, Could the fact that his writing style was in rhyme and was in a vaguely rhythmic and poetic style mean that Fluffy's spell, not Fluffy himself, because again, this is involuntary and he can't just tune it out, be fooled into thinking that it's music? This transitions me to my biggest problem with Fluffy's weakness. Honestly, what even is music in the first place? How skilled do you have to be at singing or playing a musical instrument before the sound you produce with said instrument can be counted as music? If there is no baseline skill necessary, then how is the spell supposed to know that what you're doing is music? If the spell is meant to be triggered automatically and involuntarily upon the auditory receipt of something that the spell considers to be music, then that spell needs to have a clearly defined range of options as to what it will and won't accept. Because this is so poorly thought out, Fluffy's weakness ends up being a case of pure plot convenience. Rowling obviously didn't consider any of these factors when building her world, and as a result, Fluffy's sleep spell will accept as music literally whatever the plot needs it to accept as music. It's the same problem as Harry's memory, which I complained about in Chapter 13. So upon realizing that Voldemort knows how to get past every protection the Sorcerer's Stone has, the Golden Trio run it to... oh my god. They go to Professor McGonagall and ask to see Professor Dumbledore. She explains that Dumbledore left Hogwarts 10 minutes prior after receiving an urgent owl from the Ministry of Magic. Now, because they went to the worst teacher they possibly could have gone to, McGonagall proceeds to simply dismiss their concerns out of hand. She says that the stone is too well protected, but she gives them fuck all reassurance of such. Now, if this were any ordinary student, I suppose she might be justified in withholding that kind of information. Most students don't have a right to know everything that goes on at the school, especially when that thing doesn't concern their studies. However, this isn't just some ordinary student. It's Harry freaking Potter, the arch nemesis of the greatest dark wizard of all time. No, don't give him special treatment and the privilege to break school rules just because he's famous, like Snape will often accuse Harry of doing. But when Voldemort's arch-enemy is worried about the theft of a stone that she knows damn well Voldemort wants to steal, maybe, just maybe, wait until you actually know exactly what his concerns are before you tell him that he has no right to be worried. Maybe the stone is still protected despite Harry's concerns, but how could you possibly know that unless you know what Harry's concerns are? You know, I did this joke back in Chapter 9, but I think it bears repeating here.
On Monday she's a bitch, on Tuesday she's a bitch, and Wednesday to Saturday she's a bitch. Then on Sunday just to be different to the Super King Kamehameha, bitch!
McGonagall refusing to help them, or even so much as hear their concerns, fucking bitch, the trio resolve to guard the Forbidden Corridor themselves. I especially like Harry's leadership skills being on display during this section of the chapter, when he stations Ron and Hermione at various locations, like he was directing troops in battle. However, with teachers patrolling the corridors, they don't get very far when it comes to guarding the entrance to the Forbidden Corridor. So with no other alternative, Harry resolves to go down the trapdoor himself and try to get the stone to keep it safe. Just like how I love Harry directing the troops, I also love what happens in this section of the chapter. When Ron and Hermione are worried that Harry will get expelled, he gives a rousing speech explaining how keeping Voldemort from getting his body back is more important. This has the effect of persuading Ron and Hermione to join him in his adventure, something he wasn't even trying to do. Earlier, he was a battle tactician, but here, he is a prodigy motivational speaker. In fact, he is so good at rallying the troops that he can even do it by accident. Hot damn. Now, all throughout this book, Neville has had a subplot of his own, whereby he learns to stand up for himself and grow a spine. That subplot still needs resolving, so when the Golden Trio prepare to leave Gryffindor Tower, Neville appears and is prepared to stop them. Surprisingly, Neville seems a lot braver when confronting his friends than when he confronts Malfoy. Compare this to Chapter 13, when he stutters when retorting against Malfoy during the Quidditch match. Here, he seems totally confident in snapping back at Ron, but of course, this book always has to reward the bullies and punish the victims, so when Hermione whips out her wand and performs only a single spell, that's it for Neville. He barely serves as a speed bump to the Golden Trio's plans. So then we come to the most polarizing and controversial aspect of the entire first book, the obstacles protecting the Sorcerer's Stone. Now, I've already said what I think about Fluffy's weakness, so no need to go over that again, but nearly every other obstacle is heavily criticized for being way too easy. At least with Fluffy, neither Quirrell nor the Golden Trio were able to get past him without Hagrid outright telling them what his weakness was. But with everything else, the Golden Trio, and I presume Quirrell as well, were able to improvise and figure out each obstacle as they came to them. This has garnered quite a lot of criticism from fans about how much of a joke these protections are. They were built up as this impregnable multiple layers of protection, and they're gotten past by 3 first-year students? Please. No. Just no. It doesn't bother me. None of it. Yes, I have my problems with Fluffy's weakness, but the other obstacles, I actually see them as legitimate obstacles, and no, the mere fact that 3 first-year students were able to get past them does not detract from that. First of all, we have the Devil's Snare. It starts to choke out Harry and Ron to the point where they can't even use their wands to defend themselves. They survive because Hermione does some ice cream fire spell to kill it. A lot of people scoff at this obstacle, scoffing at the idea that Hogwarts would put a plant to guard the most valuable stone of all time when they literally teach first-year students how to defeat it. This isn't even Hermione being ahead of her year, this is literally first-year curriculum at Hogwarts. However, that's simply not true. In the movies, yes, Hermione is able to defeat the Devil's Snare by reciting a poem she learned in herbology. But in the books, the only thing from herbology class that Hermione remembers is that Devil's Snare likes the dark and the damp. It's Harry who uses this information to deduce that this must mean it can be killed by the opposite environment. You know, because he's the leader and he's the one who comes up with the plans and stuff. Hell, even Ron commends Harry's leadership skills after the fact, commending Harry's ability to keep his head in a crisis. Let's also not forget that when Harry came up with the plan to use fire, Hermione doesn't quite figure out how to do that. It's up to Ron to remind Hermione that she's already has all the tools she needs right in her wand. So really, all 3 of the Golden Trio contribute to defeating the Devil's Snare. Hermione provides the raw data, Harry uses that data to come up with a plan, and Ron reminds Hermione that she can perform magic. It's only thanks to the 3 of them putting their heads together that they're able to make it out in one piece. If any one of those 3 had not come along for the ride, chances are the other 2 would have been fucked. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Yeah, but how does that make this a formidable obstacle? So they don't explicitly teach first-year students how to defeat Devil's Snare. So what? The solution is as simple as lighting it on fire. Of course the plant is gonna die. What living thing wouldn't die if you literally set it on fire? So this is still a bullshit obstacle because anyone with half a brain could figure this out. However, we also have to bear in mind that Harry and Ron were both tightly bound at this point. Harry literally couldn't light the fire himself. Let's also not forget that in Order of the Phoenix, Devil's Snare was smuggled into a hospital as a potted plant. This would suggest that Devil's Snare actually looks like a harmless regular plant until someone touches it and it starts to choke the life out of someone. Even in this chapter, Hermione only recognizes the Devil's Snare for what it is because it's already halfway towards wrapping itself around Harry and Ron, suggesting that she was only able to recognize it because it had already sprung into action. Because she was the last one to jump down after Harry and Ron had already activated the plant, she was the least ensnared by the plant, and so she had the most mobility. If only one person, such as Quirrell with Voldemort sticking out of the back of his head, were to jump down into this thing by himself, the only way he could possibly have survived is if he already knew exactly what awaited him, and already knew exactly what he needed to do to get past it. If a single person were acting alone and were caught unawares by this plant, they most likely would have died. So overall, I have to give a thumbs up on the Devil's Snare being a legitimate obstacle. What about the other obstacles? Once again, I have to say that the fan base has typically overblown how simplistic these obstacles are. Yes, these obstacles are overcome by a trio of first-year students, but these are no ordinary first-year students. Harry is the youngest Quidditch seeker in a century, so of course he has an easier time than most spotting the flying key and maneuvering his broomstick so that he can capture it like a snitch. Even then, Ron and Hermione work together to corner the key to make it easier for him to catch. So once again, the three of them managed to get past this obstacle with the power of teamwork. Ron, meanwhile, is a prodigy at chess. The mere fact that this is a game of chess against an AI should immediately tell you how much of an accomplishment it is that Ron is able to win it. Has anyone out there actually played a game of chess against the computer on max difficulty? The computer will rape your asshole and giggle while doing it. Ron is not only able to defeat the AI in this chess game, but he is doing so while making minimal use of Harry and Ron, since they are playing as pieces themselves and getting captured means they get mutilated. So Ron is playing with a huge handicap in that he can't afford to let three of his pieces be captured, a handicap he normally doesn't have to play under, and he still beats the AI. You know, when Quirrell did this obstacle, I wonder if he was able to avoid the risk of being torn to pieces by simply taking the place of the Black King. If he did that, he probably would have been safe from being captured, because the king is never captured in chess, only checkmated. Last but not least, of course, Hermione is no ordinary first year, and I don't even need to explain that one to you. That's literally her most defining character trait. As I pointed out in Chapter 6, Hermione is not only exceptionally talented, she's a downright Mary Sue of a character, so of course she's going to be able to figure out the potions puzzle. However, one thing I do have to complain about is how inconsistently the obstacles seem to be programmed to reset. How come Sprout's, McGonagall's, and Snape's obstacles each reset whenever the Golden Trio reach them, but Flitwick's and Quirrell's obstacles don't? Maybe Sprout's obstacle didn't need to reset. We never see exactly what Quirrell did to get past the Devil's Snare. Maybe he didn't kill it per se, but he actually found a way around it. But then we have the chess game. The pieces begin the game as good as new, so there's no two ways about it, the obstacle reset itself. Then Snape's potions somehow refill themselves automatically. But if these obstacles reset themselves, why don't all of them reset? The Silver Key in Flitwick's obstacle shows clear signs of having already been handled earlier that day, and when Harry and Hermione get to the troll, it's already knocked out, presumably using the same levitation spell on the club tactic that Ron used last Halloween. Why would only half the obstacles reset but the other half don't? I also have to wonder about the potions puzzle. Now, for the potion that allowed the drinker to move forward, there was only enough for one person. That makes sense. But the potion that was designed to allow the drinker to go back, there was also only enough for one person. Gee, it sure is a good thing that Ron got taken out at the chess game. Imagine if he made it all the way to the potions puzzle with Harry and Hermione. Would he and Hermione have to choose one of them to go back while the other just had to be left there to die? And last but not least, I find the designation of the obstacles to be rather odd. On their way to the troll, Hermione points out that it must have been Sprout, the herbology master, who supplied the devil's snare. That makes sense. We can also assume that Snape supplied the potions puzzle, even though that's never explicitly stated in the book. But Hermione also deduces that Flitwick, the charms teacher, supplied the flying key obstacle, while McGonagall, the transfiguration teacher, supplied the chess game. I don't know, those two seem to me like they should have been switched around. The difference between charms and transfiguration is that charms modifies something by adding a property to it that it doesn't already have, whereas transfiguration spells change the fundamental nature of the thing to make it another thing entirely. For example, when doing the Wingardium Leviosa spell to a feather or a troll's club, the feather is still a feather and the club is still a club. It's just a feather and a club that are floating in midair. You're not changing the thing itself, you're just adding the property of levitation to it. But earlier in this chapter, the Transfiguration exam had students turning mice into snuff boxes. The thing used to be a mouse, but it's not a mouse anymore. Now it's a snuff box. The students changed the mouse into something else entirely. So let's take that understanding of the two branches of magic and apply them to these obstacles. The chess pieces honestly seem like they were carved out of stone into the shape of giant chess pieces, and then were given the magical property of artificial intelligence. Think about it. Earlier in this book, the chess pieces were shown to be fully sentient and were capable of talking to and even outright disobeying the players. So if they were transfigured out of inanimate objects, where did their intelligence come from? I can think of only two ways these chess pieces could possibly have human-level intelligence. They were inanimate objects that had their intelligence charmed into them, or they were originally creatures of human level or near human intelligence who got captured and cursed to serve eternally as someone else's plaything. That latter one brings with it a whole slew of human rights issues that I'm 99% certain was never intended to be in the story. So I have to assume that the pieces started as Muggle chess pieces, only to have their intelligence charmed into them. By contrast, the flying keys seem like they used to be bats that were changed into keys with wings. This is further corroborated by the movies, which portray the keys as flying around in bat-like patterns. Honestly, I would consider it to be more humane to transfigure bats for this purpose, since bats are just dumb animals and therefore don't have the same rights as humans. Honestly, the only reason I'm not completely calling foul on this, much like I did in Chapter 14, is because Hermione's statements as to which teacher provided which obstacle are not clearly intended to be taken as sacrosanct. It's never explicitly confirmed that Flitwick did the flying keys and McGonagall did the chess set. It's only Hermione's speculation. So I'm going to assume, until I see irrefutable evidence to the contrary, that wizards' chess sets are not actual people. So anyway, Harry decides he's going to go through to the stone by himself, since there's only enough potion for one person. Hermione is terrified about how Harry's going to handle himself, but Harry decides he's just gonna wing it. Honestly, this is yet another one of Harry's character traits that I really admire. It's a perfect execution of the classic rule of writing, show, don't tell, and that character trait is his knack for improvisation. Whereas Hermione is the best at memorizing incantations out of a book, Harry is most in his element when he's in the moment, acting spontaneously. He doesn't consciously think about the mechanics of the spells he's casting. He simply acts. He simply reacts. It's like when we get into our groove, playing a difficult video game or playing a complex piece of music, until the moment we start thinking about what we're doing, at which point we immediately lose the ability to do it. We saw a bit of this back in Chapter 9, when Harry had instantly mastered the art of flying on a broom, without having to think about it. He just knew what to do. For the entire rest of the series, Harry will bring his A game when his back is to the wall. In Lupin's office, he struggles and struggles to learn how to cast a Patronus. But then, when his past self is an inch away from suffering the Dementor's kiss, that's when he pulls out his best Patronus yet. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry can't learn Occlumency to save his life when he's being taught Occlumency by Snape. But later, in Deathly Hallows, when he's being rounded up by Snatchers, that's when he brute forces his way into mastering Occlumency. He doesn't have time to recall his Occlumency lessons and remember the mechanics of how to do it, he just has to just do it. And just do it is exactly what he does. This is clearly intentional on Rowling's part. In Order of the Phoenix, when Ron and Hermione are persuading Harry to accept the position of the DA's teacher, it is stated point blank that Harry's knack for improvising his way out of a tight spot is one of his strong suits, although Harry at the time doesn't consider this to be a strong suit. Well, that one conversation might be an instance of telling rather than showing. It's only really one conversation in the entire series, but the examples of this strong suit of his are littered throughout. So the chapter ends with Harry noticing who it was. However, the narrator doesn't say who it actually is, just that it isn't Snape or Voldemort. Now, here's something that honestly quite bothers me. In the United States, books are typically set up in such a way that when you have a book laid open, the odd-numbered pages are typically on the right side of the book, while the even-numbered pages are typically on the left side. Tell me, is it the other way around in Britain? I know that when you're driving, the side of the road you're supposed to be on is reversed in Britain compared to the USA, but do you also reverse the page layout for your books? I ask this because the revelation that it was Quirrell who was trying to steal the stone is clearly intended to be a surprise reveal. It's only by starting the next chapter that we're supposed to actually get the dun-dun-dun moment that it's actually Quirrell rather than Snape. In order to facilitate this surprise reveal, it would make the most sense to have that reveal be hidden behind a page turn. That is to say, the start of chapter 17 should be an even-numbered page, so you have to turn the page in order to see the start of the chapter. However, when I first read this book as a kid, I distinctly remember noticing that it was Quirrell simply by using my peripheral vision, meaning that it happened by complete accident. I can only imagine that other kids my age similarly had this surprise reveal spoiled to us because the reveal was clearly visible on the opposite side of the book. This would suddenly make sense if odd-numbered pages in Britain are typically displayed on the left side of the book. It would still suck that I had this big reveal spoiled for me in a way that wasn't intended, but at least I would understand why it was set out the way it was. So in any event, the chapter ends, for better or worse, with Harry seeing who it is, but with the audience still kept in suspense. Or at least they're supposed to be kept in suspense. Well, do I even need to talk about the main plot advancement of this chapter? Honestly, this is basically the first half of the climax for the entire book. So, main plot advancement is literally the whole point of this chapter. Hagrid looks incompetent, giving away the secret to getting past Fluffy without even realizing he was doing it, but at least the Golden Trio is able to benefit from Hagrid's incompetence as much as Voldemort is. McGonagall is a bitch like always. Neville gets a bit of character development. At least he doesn't end up with a concussion this time, but he still learns a hard lesson about standing up to people. Luckily, next chapter he'll finally get some long overdue reward for his courage. Ron and Hermione each get moments with their skill sets to shine through. Ron's determination to sacrifice himself shows that he has the nobility and bravery of a true Gryffindor. Once again, the lion's share of character development goes to Harry. Not only does he set the climax into motion by resolving to go down the trapdoor, but his leadership skills are on magnificent display. He commands the troops, he rallies the troops, he gives impassioned motivational speeches, he connects the dots regarding the dragon egg, and it is glorious. Rowling may have her flaws in her writing style, but the way she writes Harry as a strong leader is absolutely 5-star. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have one more chapter to get through before we finish the first book. Next time, we actually get the elusive Sorcerer's Stone. Voldemort finally talks to Harry directly, and we finally get the exposition that brings everything that happened in this book full circle. So tune in next time when I review Chapter 17, The Man with Two Faces. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.